I am Chris Nichols, Hayes Chair at The Ohio State University, as we joked before. And I have the difficult task of talking about difficult history, what makes difficult wars excellent lessons, which some of this will be interrogative. I want to ask you some questions. We'll try to pull some out. That'll get us flowing towards our next conversation. And centrally, I thought, given the brief of what we're doing here, I wanted to explore a few ways in which we can help you all have these conversations and think through together some strategies there. So what I tried to do is pull together some ways in which historians have thought about and theorists have thought about difficult history itself. And this is a particularly fraught moment that we live in general, so I applaud you for engaging in conversations with the community, right? It's hard work. All of us who are committed to this in teaching and community activities know how hard this can be. It's also really meaningful work, so thank you for doing that. Thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this possible. Please fund some more of these programs if you're watching. So I want to talk a little bit about difficult history with you all and difficult wars and why they make good lessons. And one takeaway there I want to say is a lot of our conversation has revolved around the present. But I think most meaningfully, and one of the things I want to touch on as we go, is that history is your ally in this. So because of how fraught the near past is, recent deployments and other activities that we've been talking about, actually taking it at arm's length, going back to the 1770s, going back to the 19th century, can really help you to say, okay, wait, let's pause and reflect on an era that we didn't all live through, right? How did human beings in that era that we can project ourselves into their lived experience to some extent, and we can rely on experts, what they know about that. How can that help us have this conversation? So instead of, if you have to, move away from a potential conflagration of a conversation, looking back at the past can help. And then we can read that forward into the present and hopefully chart a better future. So I want to suggest just from the outset, if you've got a problem, maybe go to the past. You can certainly suggest, as we were talking about earlier, how important someone's own lived experience is in the recent past. But to help have a more abstracted conversation, if things get emotional or fraught, the history can be your ally in that way. And can be really meaningful in doing that because we can look at the historical record and see how people's experience of war has shaped their lives. We don't know yet how fully our lives will be shaped by the experience of war because we are still living and we don't have the benefit of that hindsight. So that's a way to talk about how you can do that work. And then I want to equip us with a few ways to think about difficult history, about collective memory and what that means. I don't know to what extent we've exchanged ideas about that yet, but I want to think critically about collective memory, which was coming up a little bit and thinking about these wars and masculinity as we've been going through that, and gender norms and assumptions that we have that are often uninterrogated. And then I thought I would end, after we get through some of all that, with how policymakers use history, a little bit of that, and what some of the lessons are for how decision makers use history, and to what extent then we as regular, everyday decision makers can also think that way about the little victories you can have by having these kinds of conversations. So first off, I'm grabbing a slide from a TED Talk that I did by a great artist, graphic artist named Jonathan Case, just again to start out in kind of the biggest picture of how and why this kind of conversation matters, why the experience of war matters, why history matters. And so what this is meant to evoke, which I had a lot of say in putting this together, is history is a vaccine against superficiality. That when we think about the relentless barrage of texts and emails and social media and everything that we get today, right, it's almost impossible to make inroads against that. We're all overwhelmed. So part of having an hour-long conversation is being here together, creating community, and keeping that stuff out, right? And if we have any hope of moving forward as a society, regardless of politics, some piece of that has to be to get beyond the superficial. Right? It means interacting one-on-one, looking in people's eyes, thinking about what it is to live in other people's shoes and have some kind of empathy. And in some cases, maybe to reject that's okay as well, but to do it with some semblance of civility so that you're not alienating folks. But a deeper truth, I think, is that we need to know much more about the past in order to understand what has shaped our world today. All the historians in here, I'm sure, are nodding. Everybody in here seems to love history, so I'm preaching to the choir. But the point is that if you don't do these kinds of injections periodically, you're not inoculated against superficiality. Right? So part of what hopefully you all can bring to these conversations is your level of expertise, right, as a teacher, as a thinker, to move past superficiality. And one danger in these conversations that I've found, and I've run conversations with vets, I've run conversations with regular service members, active service members, with activists, with peace activists. I've done it in communities that were all red and all blue and all mixed and across ages, and done them on NPR. And one thing that I often find is that we default back to superficiality. It's simpler, it's easier. It's like a conversation about the weather. But the reality is, we've already been hearing in all of our conversations today, is that the deeper inoculation, you could play out this analogy further if you want, right? Give you a fever, it'll be harder, but on the other end, you come out stronger, better, right? Quicker, faster, right? Maybe immune, or at least better able to survive. So I wanted to foreground that like collective mission piece of this in thinking together about this. And then one last piece of history. So this is from, it's interesting. This is from when the Made by History section of the Washington Post was founded in 2017 by our own Nikki Hemmer and Brian Rosenwald, among others. They took this quote from Martin Luther King Jr., "We're not makers of history, we're made by history." Instead of making history, we're made by history. But what they clarify in this is that King saw these two things as oppositional. Making history and being made by history were opposing forces for him. But for the historians, actually that's not the case, or at least for many historians, I think we would agree, and we can all talk about this as we go. Is making history and being made by history more a complementary act or more oppositional? And in some ways, I wanted to put this here for us in our conversation, just to think together about that history matters, that set of questions about superficiality. So some people would argue, political scientists perhaps in some ways, about the sort of overdetermined paths of history. If you're thinking in the sense of military history, the road to war, right? This series of steps leads to a particular outcome. Anybody who's been involved in any conflict, anyone who's lived and thought really critically, often has some awareness of contingency, right? Things could have gone another way. Read any scholarly argument, the implicit argument within that is that something else might have happened, right? Whatever they argue is that something else might have happened. So I wanted to plant this seed for us in thinking about, well, what factors have shaped our present moment? What factors have shaped the experience of war today? And to what extent were people agents in that? So you often hear in conversations with wider groups that they were sort of passive agents within a structure. We were talking about, someone could be patriotic and also have a lot of skepticism about the military. That they were passive agents within what the military did to them, this passive construction. Others describe their experience of war as an active one. What they were able to accomplish, what they were able to do, or were forced to do, perhaps, but still active, right, within that. So thinking about the making and made by, thinking about the sort of the ways in which passive and active operate in our own life experiences seems useful. And that might be the kind of thing you could just pause and reflect on with somebody in a conversation. So that's not asking them something critically, but to draw out some of their experience to ask about the active versus passive construction of their experience of war, whether they're on the home front or serving in combat. And I've often found people who served in an era of combat, but who were not in a combat zone, have very different feelings. And sometimes a deep stigma is attached to those who never saw combat in an era of large-scale combat. This is particularly true for the Vietnam War veterans that I found. So the active and passive constructions in those moments, in those conversations, may be really important to help point out something to them. All right, so now let's talk difficult history. A part of this I constructed this way so it would be good for being recorded for other people watching this, not necessarily for all of us in the room. So one of the things that I think is admirable about this project is trying to confront very difficult histories. We've been doing that in the room, just talking about, say, trauma today. And a big piece of that is in thinking about collective memory, which sort of scholars think about as a set of narratives shared by a particular group or society that can include blends of family stories, of national stories, of religious stories, of official accounts, collective memory can serve in that way, can be that. And we see those kinds of examples, in things like textbooks, parades, right? Collective memory is the sort of memory that's officially sanctioned, usually. So if you're thinking about difficult wars don't tend to fit as simply in collective memory, right? Or genocide doesn't fit as well. So confronting that means actually talking about that history, and it's much harder to do. These are the gray areas of historical complexity or argument, right? To confront them and to confront collective memory means to talk about things that, say, a lot of white Americans living today didn't learn. So when I did conversations in the state of Oregon about this, very often we talked about, well, why are there very few perspectives of what it was like to be a black pioneer in the state of Oregon? They said, we were never taught that in the textbooks. Then you have to interrogate why. Why is there no story of that? Well, part of it is because it's a lash law state. Let's turn to the Constitution. Actually, you couldn't be a free black person, even though it was a free state. You couldn't stay there for more than 6 months. Well, what does that history suggest about why there weren't many more black pioneers in the state of Oregon? And on, right? So you got to confront that omission, that gap in people's knowledge, because a collective memory is not a full or complete memory. It's a highly selective one, right? We know this, but it's not always obvious when you're talking with people, and it's often hard to do when you're pointing out an omission in their knowledge, essentially, right? Because it can be a pretty deep sort of a challenge. So, collective memory is essential, and it's hard to confront how to sort of talk about our shared past. So one place that I would suggest, and a lot of the literature on this and how to do these conversations suggests is useful, is to talk about a shared, a common ground of humility in the face of what we can't know or we don't know, right? So that though I may know a bit more history than a certain person, I can't know what their life experiences were, and I can't know what they may have some awareness of, even if it was outside of their shared memory. Or I myself, given my subject position, we talked about positionality before, a white heterosexual man, like perhaps my subject position renders me less able to see certain things in the world around me or in the way that I encountered collective memory itself. Like I could see myself in a band of brothers in World War II in a way that did not show to me why there weren't more black women serving. It's a simple point, but it's one that's you're reflecting on yourself, and that can draw people into the conversation. Because you're saying, oh, this is something that I missed about myself. Maybe you could share something that you missed about yourself too, right, in that way. So it brings them in by showing your vulnerability in confronting something, and you can go deeper and deeper, racism, sexism, right? You can go as far as you want to go with that kind of conversation, particularly if you start with yourself. So you're opening yourself up to the audience. Not always easy, right, to the community. So another piece that I want to emphasize just at the outset of confronting difficult history, difficult wars, as we've already heard today, and may be obvious in some ways, but it's also profoundly true. All history, all life experience, it's all revisionist. If you read biographies, right, the biographical accounts, memoirs written by younger people look radically different from when they write their life biographies and memoirs later. Radically. Historians, we're always revising. There's no set sort of interpretation. Once that book or article is out, even before it's out, while it's in press, there's still revision going on. So I would suggest, as you all think about this, we've talked about the multiple perspectives on the experience of war. Also think about how that's changing itself, right? Right now, in this moment. War with Ukraine has totally altered how I speak about the war, 13 months before this present moment. Without that, right, I would have talked about NATO differently. I would have talked about the U.S. commitment to Europe differently. Okay, then go farther, just another 2 years back, right? The experience of war, the experience of the Trump presidency, now shifting to a Biden presidency, thinking about their views about the military, not about politics, just views about the military. What's the future of war for the U.S.? So again, revisionist in the presentist sense, revision all throughout different biographies and lived experience. So I would say reject people who say, hey, that's revisionist, that's wrong, and embrace revisionism as your ally in helping people think about the experience of war, because it's always changing. As we've seen already, and think about masculinity and gender, right? Popular cultural perceptions of war, oh my God, they're constantly changing as well. So context, we already have a good sense of this. We talked a little bit about monuments and denaming, I gather, But one piece of context that's just crucial to understand too, if you're thinking about the kind of triumphalist collective memory accounts of wars, naming and denaming, monuments, a whole lot of that is about context. So what historians argue here, and I think the vast majority, if not the consensus, is that you can't understand naming and denaming without knowing when something and why something was consecrated in the way that it was. And once you do that, you're no longer talking about the authenticity of the history of the past, but rather you're talking about the moment in which something got named or denamed. Right? So the classic example, I did this presentation to the board of the Oregon Historical Society, and there are a lot of folks, pretty conservative, who said we're erasing the past by taking names out, we're erasing the past by taking down these monuments. So then we did a little investigation and talked about, well, why were these buildings named for these people? Why were these monuments put up, and when? Exactly when were they put up? And let's go to the primary sources, let's go to the context. What did they say? You know, historians in the room nodding, right? You're all nodding. What did they say? They had very particular reasons for putting up a Robert E. Lee statue in the late 19th century in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it wasn't about Robert E. Lee's generalship, primarily. It was primarily about Jim Crow and white supremacy in an era of flux and changing politics in that moment. You cannot erase Robert E. Lee's generalship or role in the Civil War, no matter how many monuments you take down. Now, you may object to taking down the monument, but you're not going to erase that history. It's just not possible. I think the joking number that historians give is that we've written a book a day since the end of the Civil War. I mean, how many of those involve Lee? Like, you're not going to get rid of him even with a massive book burning and digital destruction campaign. So, joking aside there, the point is context really matters. So when you're thinking about, say, accounts of war, shaping that more fully in thinking about the different eras in which we've talked about wars differently. The Civil War, there's been a proliferation of arguments about the Civil War in the last few years in the US. Why?
You're talking about renaming all the military posts that have a Confederate general's name on it?
Well, that's the first level reason. Yeah, so we're talking about renaming
Fort Leonard Wood, Fort Lee, Fort Jackson, I think it's Fort Jackson.
Fort Hood.
Fort
Bragg, long list. Okay, but why are we really talking about that?
I know how to sell a magazine. I put the new Civil War on the cover. That should sell it.
Yeah. So
the next Civil War.
a big part of why we're talking about the long tail of the Civil War. There's books, a colleague of ours, Civil War by Another Means, another colleague of ours, How the South Won the Civil War, Heather Cox Richardson, the most famous historian on Substack, who's amazing.
Republican Party.
Yeah.
You're talking about like maybe the divide in the United States nowadays is almost like revving up for a new Civil War?
Precisely. So we are fighting over, this is difficult history, we're fighting over difficult history in the past because of the present. Now, historians like David Blight have said, one way to think about denaming and monuments is anybody who's ever a traitor to their country, whatever their country was, probably shouldn't have something monumentalized for them. That's not a bad first pass, like kind of test, right? Okay, fine. Yeah, it seems fair. But more significantly, we're not really even talking about that traitor to your country, although some partisans, of course, are, and some want a civil war. What I'm suggesting in bringing this up is the Civil War is long past, and yet it's so much with us in the way that some other conflicts aren't. We're not having an argument over the Mexican-American War. We're not having an argument over the War of 1812. Or if you're thinking about it, we're not having an argument over the conquest or reconquest, although there's been some changes about how we think about Columbus. Right? We're not actually thinking about that process of manifest destiny and dispossession and Indian removal. We're not really having those conversations. Why? Because at the high political level, we're talking about what you noted, right? Serious divisions in the country, and it also gets into questions of militarism, right? War, other permutations of what we're thinking about. Who and what matters, right? Monumentalizing who and what matters, commemorating them. And so that's why this history is so challenging. When we get to a few more definitions, we can push through that. But I think this moment too suggests that, and some of your conversations may go this way if it gets political or if it gets really moral, people taking a moral stand about this, is that it gets into questions of heritage. It gets very personal very fast, right? My ancestors fought in the Civil War. You don't hear people talk much anymore in this era of being sons or daughters of the American Revolution. That used to be what people talked about. They aspired to be sons or daughters of the American Revolution. It's true in some places that matters, but really the Civil War is our touch point for that now as a heritage. And people talk about the Second World War, but as we were saying, as if there weren't draft dodging, as if there weren't lots of people who didn't want to serve, right? We've omitted that part of the collective memory story, but having veterans who were in the Second World War in a family isn't a really significant breaking point in terms of a collective memory set of divisions. It goes back to something more fundamental. And why? Because we're talking about one of the most crucial issues in American society today, racism and inequality, right? And how you think about who deserves blame and who should be commemorated in that history then dictates how you think about a lot of elements of our contemporary moment. What political party you're in favor of, what kinds of reforms you want, how you think about a just and diverse society, all kinds of stuff, right? So I don't want to go too far on that, but just thinking about those approaches to naming and denaming, how important context is. So if somebody brings up their erasing history, you can deploy this set of questions. Look at the context in which this monument was put up. Look at what they said. Who was there? Who commemorated it? Why were the Daughters of the Confederacy there in white robes and breaking a champagne glass on, or why did Yale name a college for a secessionist who only went there as an undergrad, right? In what era did that happen? Like Calhoun College. And then they rename it because they thought, hey, he didn't really have much relationship to this institution. Those are the sorts of questions you can ask. And you can ask your audience that, right? You can ask people, well, you can unpack it with our collective knowledge in the room. This is what we do in the college classroom all the time. And by bringing it out of the audience and not giving it to them, it's a win, That's kind of difficult history 101. If you have to tell people, if you go too far telling people, they're not going to hear. They can't hear it, right? So that's another lesson of this that I've certainly learned in presenting on some of these topics. You got to pull it out of the group, and the more you do it, the better you are at it. So there's obviously a bunch of other things here. You've already established. You'll establish at the beginning like solid principles, agreed on starting points, like core elements of that, and affirming pedagogy. Even if somebody's going long, you affirm what they're up to. You affirm what they're saying. Right? Your experience is your own. We're not questioning that. And you could channel that in then to these other levels of questions. And so I want to sort of kind of think about the challenges and strategies briefly here, and I keep moving through. One of the things I think is useful, this is at the end of what's on the slide, what wider publics want to hear, what do they come to hear? They're signing up to talk about the experience of war. So you've got them already in the sense of coming into this setting. But you don't know why they're there. Maybe they were dragged by their partner, which we were talking about a little bit before. They may, in fact, really want to talk. It's partly why they got dragged, right? Sometimes we do things we want to do, and we pretend that we didn't want to do it, right? That's a piece of that. But then there's a question of what they can kind of take on board. So if you're questioning a lot of their core assumptions, which is what difficult history does, and difficult wars are all about this, you could make it a march through atrocities, both sides of a conflict, one side of a conflict. That will turn a lot of people off. So how far can you push that? That's partly about reading the room, but it's partly about preparation, I would say. So you need to know where you want to get to, right? This is the lawyerly question. This is what people who advise policymakers on how to use history say. Never ask a question that you don't know the answer to, but in some ways it doesn't matter what the answers are. That's where I'll land part of this presentation, but that's one of the ways that those who've urged history onto policymakers push them to think. Use history, think historically, think in terms of streams of time. Don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, but have them filling the room with answers. Because at the end of the day, the best takeaway you can get is just a marginal improvement, just a marginal move. If you're thinking you'll get them really far with the list of atrocities and difficult wars, or the list of heroism and amazing things that the US has done, you're probably not going to move the needle at all. Right? You just want to move the needle a little bit, and that's how for me, that's how I take away from every community conversation. Just a little needle move, that's a win. And then another way that I've thought a lot about doing this is keywords and key phrases that you can bring to an audience and pull from them, especially if you're talking about war. We've already heard about a bunch of these, right? So, if you're thinking about, and I'll talk a little bit about this, sort of the myth of America, and we'll get into some of these keywords and key phrases about, being a just nation, about liberty, about freedom. You could think about recent presidencies and political rhetoric. You can think about things that you hear in church and community groups. You could think about things that you want to hear, things that are not expressed as key phrases. phrases, but they are to you. So that you can unpack a key phrase. This is a sort of long-standing kind of philosophical, oratorical trick. Give people a key phrase and then have them fill the vessel of it. What does it mean to you to talk about the U.S.'s mission in the world? What does it mean to you to think about the U.S. as a guarantor of liberty? Or what does the term national security mean to you, right? And what are the limits of national security? What will you not do in the service of that? And that, we historians, this is what we do for fun, and this is what troubles us and keeps us up at night, right? Because we know where the worst and the best of what those kinds of phrases can do. They can generate wars, they can generate social transformations, they can save people, they could kill people, right? They are literally, and most importantly, why people die. Because we fight for causes and words and ideas. It raises hairs on the back of your neck. So if you use some of these phrases with an audience, you can help them unpack that and then use that as a way to think about the experience of war. It's a really powerful technique. And it gets you the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because when you think about the US as a guarantor of liberty, you think about the US as trying to say a freedom agenda in the world, right? So George Bush famously rejected nation building. He said, I'm not in a nation building project. It's a freedom agenda, and peoples and groups around the world want this. And I'm not putting any valence on that. What does that mean to you as an audience? What does that mean to you having served? What does that mean to you if you served in a previous conflict? What does that mean to you? What does a freedom agenda mean? So you can get to the ugly, but there's also some transcendent good, right, in that. And so then it's about balancing that. And that's another tool, I would say, that I like to use in these kinds of settings. All right, so I want to do 3 kind of big takeaway pieces of difficult wars, what they reveal as good lessons. So some of my colleagues have even written on these things, so feel free to chime in if you have thoughts. So 3 kind of big sorts of topics that then will lend themselves to keywords, key concepts, that sort of thing. American way of war, a myth of America, and ideology and ideals. So in literature about military history, literature on sort of the cultural politics of American war and peace, the American way of war is a concept. You'll find it in encyclopedias, you will find it in debates, you'll find it in theory, you'll find it poorly used, you will find it occasionally well used, very, very infrequently well defined. What is an American way of war is a thing you can ask. And there are several theories about that. You can unpack that historically. So, we've talked a lot about the US and military experience and the draft. And when there's a large army, I studied ideas about the limits of US power. I study isolationism and the people who push back against a strong military industrial complex, going back to the founders, these kinds of things. And one of the arguments you find early in American history about an American way of war is that it should not be professionals who fight wars, that there should not be a large standing army, that in fact people like Cincinnatus or George Washington, who are gentlemen warriors, were the best kinds of warriors to have in a society. And the fact that we have a large entrenched professional military is a problem. Would be a problem. It would be like being the British or Prussians in another era. They also, although the US adapted tons of Prussian strategic techniques. So I would encourage you all to think, and we could talk more about this, what is an American way of war? How does that change over time? You find critiques of this, especially in the Vietnam War era from the New Left. The American way of war is interventionist, is like a juggernaut car running over poor peoples. That's the phrase of William James when he was thinking about the Spanish-American War. That the American way of war is an imperialist project. And then you get equal and opposite kinds of claims about an American way of war is really much more delicate, is much more committed to human rights. Spanish-American War comes up there too, that the Cubans were being so poorly treated by Spain, and they were, absolutely, that any intervention on their behalf was a net positive, no matter how bad other elements were. Same thing with the Filipinos. So you can go back and forth and think about not just a binary there, but a kind of long spectrum American way of war. Myth of America, a great historian, highly recommend essays by Walter Hickson on this. One of the things I take away from the myth of America as a concept, and here's where you get tons of your ideas, right? Manifest destiny, providentialism, a chosen people, the myth of America. This is a fruitful place for you to talk about. whether people are landing on the side that there's no social mobility in the US, that it's a terrible racist place, or they're landing on the side of it's an amazing place, the best country, the most fantastic, wherever they're landing, right? You can interrogate the myth of America in terms of the experience of war. Because it is war making in the US and virtually every other country that I'm conversant in their history is premised on a kind of mythology of the nation state, or a mythology of the state that is waging war. And therefore there is necessarily a set of myths, real and imagined kinds of truths about that country that get people to do that one thing, that most important thing in human existence, which is die for a cause. Or kill for a cause, right? So, within that, you can come up with all kinds of terms and concepts and ways to move forward. One of the things that Hickson argues is that the history of the myth of America is one of regeneration through violence and regeneration through war. And the key to what we were hearing earlier from Heather and from Amy is one key to understanding the myth of America and regeneration through war is that wars make citizens. Wars prove citizenship. Wars also show, like all crises, they cast in sharp relief the fractures and fissures in society. And so I would suggest, why do we hear about the Civil War right now? The US is still in a state of kind of permanent war abroad and at home. And part of what we're seeing through the pandemic and other crises is a kind of warlike state in which we are seeing the fractures and fissures in society, not just polarization and racism and inequality, but a society that doesn't seem structured to support all individuals within it. And this is the kind of claims that say, you would hear from W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual going into the First World War, who argued that African-Americans should, quote, close ranks. It's the thing he comes to reject many of his own previous principles. It's the thing he most objected to. He said it was okay, briefly, for people of color to go to segregated induction camps because they could prove their right as citizens to go fight in this war. They would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they deserve full citizenship rights. And then practically within a year of that, and the war for the US ends pretty rapidly, he's saying, oh, that was such a mistake. And then coming back from the war, famous high-profile lynchings of African-American troops in uniform, right? It very much shows, so the myth of America, an equal and just country going out in the world to spread democracy, to make the world safe for democracy, right? So you can see that, even as you can also see the good in that, right? And I want us to hold on to those two things, because in the conversations with people, you need to have some of the good, otherwise it'll be incredibly depressing and sad. But it's also a good way to show how the US isn't living up to its ideals, right? And so part, I think, of thinking about the experience of war is to show through these crisis moments just how much is possible for the country to do, how much more the nation is capable of achieving its ideals. It's shown in sharp relief in wartime. It may be shown more in wartime than at any other moment, even other crises like, say, depression or pandemic. We could argue about that. And then, so finally, ideology and ideals. It's another way to loop into these other elements. But I wanted to foreground that to say, we've talked a little bit about other kinds of ideas at work, and I have two here, sort of what is America, who is America? For me, one of the things that animates my work on this is the changing structures of those questions and debates. So, who and what counts as an American, which we're just talking about, for service. Why is it that some people who've served get more access to the rights of serving than others? What are the core assumptions and ideologies at work that we're not unpacking? Like, white male bread earners. Why wouldn't women who served get equal access to that? Right? It seems obvious, as the obvious kind of question to us now, sitting here in this room, who we care. Well, what are we missing today in our core ideas and ideologies about service, about the experience of war, that somebody sitting here in 50 or 100 or just 10 years will notice that we're not accounting for, right? What ideals or ideologies can we unpack? And I think that's also an interesting element possible for these conversations on the experience of war. So say, what are our blinders? What are we missing? And again, like the technique that I described earlier, you can say, okay, I know that I'm missing a few things here. Maybe start with something you think you're missing, and then see what other people could say. Or, the other thing, if you think about the memoirs I was describing and change over time in one life, a younger service member has a very different experience than someone who's a career military officer, right? We were talking about that. People who say retire early, for instance, for their own reasons, or are discharged for a variety of other reasons, have different relationships to that. So you might say something about what are the ideologies at work in how we assess the different types of experiences of war and the longitudinal change in a career related to the military. That sounds highfalutin or something harder to do. But what I'm essentially suggesting is that there may be ways in which we are privileging a certain kind of service or time in, or a certain way of thinking about military experience that itself is problematic. That sort of age dimensions, career dimensions, that sort of thing. Even though, like, joking about the text you want to serve, right? Yeah, I've already served, that kind of thing. There may be ideals and ideologies at work there that we need to unpack, or maybe in a group setting that could be useful. I don't want to belabor that too much. This is another slide more intended for our viewers online because it's small. So I wanted to say, okay, well, what's difficult history? I joked with John walking in, or he joked with me. What makes difficult history difficult? So the term itself comes, it's really just in the last couple decades, and it comes from people thinking about trauma, about difficult knowledge, coined in relation to traumatic, sensitive, or violent pasts. So, one of the things to say when you think about some of these subjects is to give people, sort of warning that they're going to be potentially triggering, right? Thinking about difficult wars, especially if you go deeper and think about atrocities in conflicts, but just the lived experience of your average service member who sees combat, they often see some pretty terrible stuff or involved in some pretty terrible stuff. And those who aren't, we talked about this war at a distance. We haven't talked very much about that. I think the future of war, one of the things that we're seeing in very high-tech countries is part of the future of war is trauma at a long distance. Drone operators in Las Vegas working 12-hour days, repeatedly, seeing the results of what they've done and then coming directly back to their families at the end of the day. It's a different way of thinking about the experience of war. And I think that fits with this sort of new ways that people are thinking about the difficulties of difficult histories. This kind of, there can be a violent present for someone living in Las Vegas who's seeing combat every day and is not in a combat zone in the way that we tend to think about it. What are other ways that we could think about that, right? The nurses, the Red Cross folks who are in Vietnam that we were hearing about before. What are other ways that we can think about other kinds of service that exposes people to trauma, to difficult kinds of knowledge that they may or may not want to share, and then affirming that. So if someone is saying something about, say, visiting, seeing some of this from afar, or visiting folks in the front line, maybe there's a way that you could talk about that's the difficulties, the traumatic knowledge of that with that group. Another way that I wanted to just toss this at us is to say that what makes difficult history difficult, and this is in the broader sense, not just in the war experience of war, is not how it confirms or complicates a particular person's prior historical understanding, but the degree to which it challenges or undermines the dominant societal narrative. So this is from two scholars who've written a lot about difficult history, what makes it difficult. And what I'm getting at there is when we're thinking about particularly racism and sexism in American society, that's a huge part of this story. The battles that we're hearing now today about the war is over, what history should be taught, that kind of thing. But what I'm really also suggesting for this group, for the experience of war, is that if you confront some people with some more accurate or deeper or different historical accounts or personal lived experiential accounts, it may really undermine how individuals in that room think about the broader narrative. There may be people who are perhaps not as enlightened as those in here or not as open-minded, right, who don't want to let in that crack of what really happened in Iraq or Afghanistan in the way that someone else experienced it, right, or Vietnam or Korea. And so that's part of this project. I mean, that's why I admire doing these conversations, why they're so hard. And it's worth really foregrounding, because I think if you think about the fact that you're challenging or undermining a dominant social narrative, it's not just their view of themselves, but something much bigger, right? The US goes out in the world and for some people does no harm. It's very hard to puncture that. I don't know any vets, pretty much, who subscribe to that if they've served a lot. But there are some. But there are a lot of people in American society who subscribe to that. And they may be the partner of a vet, because they don't want to believe that person who would, between the two of us, say something, was part of a project that did some harm. And I'm not talking, again, I'm trying to be diplomatic about it. There's a lot of ways you could talk about that. And so I think, challenging a dominant social narrative is no small ask when you have a very brief amount of time. So, in my experience, I do that as delicately as I can when I work with community groups, right? Because this is not about me on high telling them how they should understand, but rather, trying to move that needle just a little bit, right? And sometimes, again, and one of the reasons that it's great to have some vets leading these groups is that you can do that through personal experience, which I keep defaulting back to. That's not the end-all be-all, and sometimes it's a problem, but I think it's a saving grace potentially when you run up against folks who really don't want to hear that kind of thing. All right, so I wanted to run briefly through a few conflicts. We're going to talk more about the Spanish-American War in a little bit, so I just want to start us out with one of my favorite slides. We're doing favorite slides, favorite images from different eras, so it's only fair for me to do one of mine. I bet you all have seen this one. So this is Civilization Begins at Home. It's an anti-imperialist tract. And what I wanted to emphasize in bringing this up as a difficult concept, as a difficult moment, is something that I do in almost all my work. And I think all the historians in here do this too, or at least care about it as far as I know your work, is that there's a relationship between domestic and foreign, a very close relationship, domestic and foreign. And it's especially true in times of war because it's so viscerally felt by American citizens. So Civilization Begins at Home. You see in the map, I'll unpack it for us briefly, and we can talk more about it when we do our Spanish-American War conversation, because we've got time for that. So you just see there President William McKinley avariciously looking at the Philippine Islands. And you've got the Lady Justice, Lady Liberty, right? The scales are tilted towards him. She's not blind. She's not blindfolded. Unveiling behind the scenes what's really going on in society at home. Civilization begins at home, and you see, lynching. You see poverty. You see all the ways in which the kind of expressed mission, the sort of orientation of the U.S. role in the world, the American way of war meets a myth of America, right? Going out in the world to do good, and in fact, trying to civilize the world. What's happening behind the scenes? There's a whole lot of bad things, right? Is U.S. leadership taking its eyes off the ball? Is the American war-making project about something other than the war itself? Or is it actually just fundamentally missing the fact that its ideals are not being lived up to here, and that makes it more hypocrisy to do something abroad? There's a lot of ways to unpack this, and we'll have more opportunities to talk about it, but I just want to toss that out there because this is a formative moment in U.S. foreign policy and war-making at which you, for the first time in a modern sense, I would argue, you see an argument for the ways in which special interests are a problem, the ways in which Americans are thinking that it's big business, it's big press, it's the yellow journalists getting us into wars. There's some of that in earlier eras, but this is a turn to a kind of modern sensibility, a modern set of critiques. The Anti-Imperialist League of this moment talks a lot about this. So special interests bring the U.S. into wars. Partisan politics makes war more likely. Financial bets, especially the desire for new markets and new territories. So the U.S. as an imperial force in the world. So these are all critiques that are embedded here. And a big part of the Civilization Begins at Home is the argument to expose the fact that the McKinley administration, the Roosevelt later, are doing things that fundamentally are not civilizing in the way that they're claiming. So I wanted to argue that World War I is the U.S.'s unknown difficult war. And toss this out there at us. So I'm not doing our most recent conflicts because those are difficult and harder in the room, and you all will do that as well as possible, although we can talk more about that. So World War I is the U.S.'s unknown difficult war. I think I would argue, so we've got our World War II so far in. We're going to do more Spanish-American War. The Second World War as the good war stands in sharp contrast, right, to the First World War. The U.S. did not get involved or invested from 1914 and 1915 and 1916. The U.S. didn't declare war until April 1917. Interesting sort of little known fact, the U.S. tends to declare war in the spring. Generally speaking, spring is when the U.S. has wound up in wars. The U.S. war proclamations, virtually all of them are defensive in nature. And most of the modern conflicts involve land, sea, or just sea areas. So you can run through the Maine, the Lusitania, and a series of other things. The Pearl Harbor, the Gulf of Tonkin. Yeah, so not that that's anything so profound, but it's an interesting little like tidbit as you go through thinking about what gets the U.S. thinking about war. And I would argue that part of that is that you can make a claim about sort of territoriality without the U.S. being invaded. You can make a claim that these ships represent a threat, so it's kind of insecurity, that then you can justify conflict, right? So you don't actually have to have the U.S. invaded. You just have to say that the territorial sovereignty was transgressed, autonomy was transgressed in some way, and you can move forward. I don't mean that in a diabolical sense. I just mean that in the sense of how and why wars are declared and what the rhetoric is about that. Again, this is important if you're thinking about what keywords do we want to pull out, active and passive. The U.S. never actively makes war. Read any war declaration. It's always thrust upon the U.S. in some way, shape, or form. The U.S. doesn't have territorial ambitions. Every war declaration says that as well, despite the fact that the U.S. tends to take territories or get access in some form or hold territory. We could talk about that more. In any case, unknown difficult war. In something like 9 states, the National Guard was called out because of massive draft dodging in World War I. It was incredibly hard to put together the U.S. forces to fight the war. One of the reasons I like this flag, this Child Hassam Allies Day sign and image is that it suggests that the U.S. had allies in World War I, which is not formally true. The U.S. was an associate power. It fought under no other flag than the American flag, which is partly why the U.S. didn't muster its troops as rapidly for combat. And because the U.S. fought as an associate power, it still stuck to these long-standing ideals about U.S. autonomy, unilateralism, right? Steering clear of foreign entanglements, not having a large standing army. So, one famous anecdote from the end of World War I is that as soon as the war ends on November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, in early December, if you called any of the war offices, you might well get no one on the phone because that's how fast they were demobilizing. Think about that. Right? That's how fast they're moving, just within a month. Now there's war's over. Right? But after the Second World War, the way we think about the experience of war, mobilizing for war, permanent garrison state, right? The U.S. has an arsenal of democracy. So, World War I is this fascinating moment where it takes a long time to get the U.S. involved. The U.S. does not fight and die like its allies. More American troops roughly die from flu and disease than actually die in combat. It's an arguable reason why the U.S. did not get some of what it wanted at the Treaty of Versailles and in the Paris Peace. I could go on with the diplomacy, but my point is that many wars are more difficult than you think. Right? We just glide over this when you think about the history, and we already heard about how lots of people didn't want to fight and enlist in the Second World War. Well, it's even more true for World War I, which most Americans don't know anything about. And globally, World War I was cataclysmic and one of the most important shaping factors for the Bolshevik Revolution, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right, the transformation of Central Europe. Globally, more than 1 million Indians fight in World War I. I mean, it's a enormously transformative moment. Add the pandemic to that, with something like 50 million people dying around the world, and you don't have the world that we think of today without that. And the U.S. is a tiny player in that, largely because it stays out of the war. And if you want to think more about how history and the experience of war are reinterpreted, one of the reasons for the America First Committee from 1940 to 41, how unpopular World War II was for most Americans leading into that war, is World War I. Because they're reading histories of World War I, and they're thinking the U.S. should not have been involved in this war. The U.S. special interests, financial interests, the industry involved in war making, they were all crucial to getting a roughly 800 to 1 bet on the Allies in the First World War before the U.S. gets in there. So the argument in the 30s is that the so-called merchants of death got the U.S. into the war. And the U.S. war making in that era was thought of as a real problem. You're getting the U.S. pulling Marines out of Haiti and Nicaragua. The fact that the U.S. is a permanent occupier in the 20s and 30s in the Caribbean and Central and South America is beginning to prop up so-called Frankenstein dictators in these countries. In the experience of war then, you get people like Smedley Butler and other folks coming out. You get a whole different set of perceptions about the U.S.'s imperial power and overreach and overstretch. And part of that was getting involved in European power politics and fighting that war, right? There's very little popular cultural understandings about World War I anymore, but that was a dominant way of thinking. And for most people who didn't want the US to be involved in the Second World War, I would argue, they're almost all reflecting on the experience of World War I, what they think got the US in it, that they thought that most people who died or were harmed in the US context shouldn't have, that it was not a war in the nation's best interest.
I mean, it's interesting how many people who were writing during World War I, like Randolph Moore and people like that,
Yeah.
were roaring back in the Vietnam era.
Yep.
You know, it's a fascinating,
Totally.
yeah. Fascinating cycle.
It is, yeah.
Because they sort of lay down the tracks that you almost can't improve on when
Right.
it comes to opposition to war or America's involvement in a war. It's
Yeah.
really remarkable.
It is, absolutely.
And then a lot came back in 2005.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
That certainly helped.
Yeah,
I
right.
did. That's exactly where I was writing from.
Yeah.
You know, that era.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that era's set of ideas and concepts are our toolkit today if you want to
Oh, there's no doubt
right,
about it.
create any alternative way of thinking
Yeah.
about a U.S. war making in the way that it was then. Yeah.
I just want to make a point because Russia, I've studied Russia most of my life, adult life. I mean, how many of you knew that in 1919 and 1920, American GIs were dying above the Arctic Circle,
Yeah, it's fascinating.
fighting the Bolsheviks, and deployed to Vladivostok into eastern Siberia on rail lines, fighting the Bolsheviks?
Yeah.
Did anyone not?
All right.
That's
Yeah.
remarkable.
It's astonishing.
It
Yeah.
is.
Now that didn't have the implications that you just talked about.
Right.
Not this, I'm not trying to say it compared, but I didn't know this
Yeah.
until like 7 or 8 years ago. That this, and there's been some new publications about
Yep.
this. And is anyone here from Detroit? So if you go to Detroit, on one of the main avenues there's a giant polar bear, and the unit that was up on Mark Ingles.
Yeah.
No,
was,
that is.
was
never heard of
the
that.
polar bear unit, and that's where most of the soldiers came from, West
Yeah.
Michigan.
Mhm.
It's fascinating.
It is.
Huh.
Yeah. And then if
tell
you
your whole story about how critical the view of World War I is and how it, it's impacting on what if we're going to go to war again. Just watching the movie Sergeant York.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because Sergeant York is a World War I hero, and he doesn't want to go to war anymore.
Yep.
And we didn't want to go to World War I because
Right.
and so the movie is basically conversion. We know World War I was bad, but hey, this is going to be better.
This is going to be better.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, for this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to finish, what's crazy about the US intervention in the Soviet Union is 2 years later, Herbert Hoover
Yes.
is running an administration, because he was an excellent administrator,
Absolutely.
trying to save Russia or the Soviet Union from massive famine and starvation. 2 years later, millions and millions of dollars of food were sent to the Soviet Union to prevent people from dying.
And he got that. He was the
Amazing.
food guy though.
Yeah. Right.
That was his
Right.
responsibility.
Belgian relief, and then.
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
during World War I, he was in charge of food.
That's right.
And that, that's another interesting thing to think about is the ways in which the experience of war is also about peacemaking, shaping the peace, humanitarian relief, both in the way that we imagine it and in the real experience of it. And that Hoover brings that experience from the Belgian relief in World War I to Russia, but also most importantly to a huge Mississippi flood in the U.S., which then makes, so he's leveraging wartime experience, though he's not serving in arms, at home and abroad in different sorts of ways, right? And using the experience of the literal, organizational principle, engineering organizational principles to do that. And that's another element of thinking about, it's also a way that you justify war making, of course, right? Peacekeeping operations, right? Humanitarian operations, and the extension thereof. So Pearl Harbor, right, of course, creates the active response in terms of a defensive conflict and a good war, and we could talk more about that in some of the comparisons we're thinking about the Spanish-American War. I wanted to talk about Vietnam as a difficult war, right? And this is 2015 from the Japan Times, which I thought was interesting, so that's why I put it there. Uncle Sam, we've seen a lot of propaganda imagery. Uncle Sam, young, vigorous, shirtless, strong, pondering the defeat in Vietnam, and kind of also memorialized or monumentalized, right? And so a kind of way in which people's views about Vietnam in some ways were sort of cast in amber and just held there. and not fully interrogated, I would say. So you had those who said stab in the back theory about the U.S. could have won, should have won all of the major moments of combat, and then the other theory shouldn't have been there in the first place, mistaken. You can listen to the presidential recordings, the secretly recording tapes. LBJ's admitting it in '64. It's pretty disconcerting if you fought in that conflict to hear him say that's not worth fighting for. But they're kind of sealed in amber, and the resolution, I think, I don't find it in American public discourse, really. So in that way, Vietnam as an American war, as an American way of making war, is an interesting thing to maybe unpack with some veterans to talk through if you get some of those folks in there. And I've had some success thinking about that with Vietnam vets, trying to break that amber and say, okay, we've come this far. Now how do you think about it this amount of time later? And not just your service, but the broader conflict itself, right? So in some ways, that's another trick you can do, right? You can say at arm's length, we have this amount of time that has passed, and we have historical memory. Let's reinterpret this together in the room. I found that can work. It doesn't necessarily work. Sorry, so I wanted to put this up for the recording, especially, but just to quickly talk through a few difficult history moments and then kind of wrap it up. So here's 5 things that those folks I cited before thinking about difficult history that I just wanted to foreground for us here. And maybe this will go into our conversation thinking about the Spanish-American War. Difficult histories are central to a nation's history. I mean, this animates some of my work, whether or not they're recognized by political elites, right? So if you think about our current time, despite the fact that the last 2 administrations have helped pull the U.S. out of conflicts, they don't really recognize how difficult that is, I would argue, in political rhetoric. We just had a State of the Union. It did not say much about veterans other than the usual lip service. Our current president's own son, died after service, in service. So I think that's interesting and useful, just to note, right? And that's a way to think through difficult histories. They tend to refute broadly accepted versions of the past or national values. So that's another way. A difficult history of any recent conflict, of any recent war experience will refute something of our national history. Unfortunately, it's true. You could say the same is true for other nations and other war making as well. Look no further than Putin's current war in Ukraine. A close look at that difficult conflict for any Russian citizen would suggest that the purported rationale for the conflict and the way that it's rolling out, right, it shows the sheer hypocrisy. And I'm not trying to create that a false parallelism with the U.S.'s, but simply to note that virtually any conflict exposes some of those things, right? By definition. Difficult histories connect with questions or problems facing us today. We've covered some of that, but I just wanted to note that here, something you might want to say, right? This history, your lived experience, this experience of war says something about our current moment. Difficult histories often involve violence, right? And here's the really important thing, right? Usually collective or state-sanctioned violence is part of difficult history, whether it's history of Reconstruction, right, and our thinking about the end of the Civil War, why do we live in a world like this, or outright declared wars and conflicts. And so I think, again, what unites a lot of this difficult history, what are the good lessons you can get from difficult wars? I think conflict is essential for those good lessons, unfortunately. Not essential, I hope, for human societies, but they seem to have been, but for the lessons that we can take out of them in our conversations. And then finally, difficult histories create disequilibrium and challenge existing historical understandings. They do that for all of us, and that's really hard with audiences. So that's why you have to go very, very slowly with communities. You can't go too far. So beware pushing that too far in a conversation in confronting those elements. I'll leave these. Or actually, let me do this. So this is how high policymakers think. This comes from Richard Neustadt and Ernest May's book, Thinking in Time, The Uses of History for Decision Makers.
Is that still, would you say, the standard?
It is, I think, yeah.
Which is very interesting, isn't it? That,
yeah.
I mean, it's 1987.
Yep, yeah. So this is, it's a book, they got advice from lots of policymakers on it, fairly famous folks. And what I, partly for our recording and partly for our audience and our next thinking about the Spanish-American War, and maybe how you can operationalize some of this, I wanted to suggest that they use the example of George Marshall, famous George Marshall Plan, right? Both in wartime, in the Second World War, and in thinking about the peacemaking. And they argue that he thought in time streams. And this is what I think will be useful. This is why I wanted to conclude around here in our conversation. Time streams about good wars and difficult wars, lessons you can learn from different conflicts. So he actually, one of his first positions was after the Spanish-American War, was in the Philippines. And his career goes all the way up into the Reconstruction of Europe, Secretary of State, all this stuff. Okay. So, and one of the reasons that he does and doesn't do a variety of things is related to his read on history and the ways in which there are continuities and changes through different wars, different experience of wars, different strategies that have worked and not worked. So what they're encouraging policymakers to think about is to line up these longer histories, no matter how much time they have. And they argue they don't have a lot of time. So they say, I have the quote there, we tend to overuse analogies, especially in arguments, and underuse everything else. So try to get in little histories of issues, individuals, institutions. So if you're doing this, if you're programmatically thinking, like, how can I add something on experience of war in my prep for this conversation, you might think about a couple examples of individuals in different conflicts, and then make a time stream of that. How did they experience the war, home front? What was their family life like? What were, as we've been talking about, gender norms, masculinity, how did that operate? Just a little capsule biography, and then another comparable one for another conflict, and another for another, right? And so what they say is by thinking in time streams, Marshall was really capable of lining up possible outcomes that were either positive or negative. So they say that, look, he's advised to send a whole lot of troops to a number of places around the world, including to support Chiang Kai-shek's armies in China, and he decides not to. He's advised by somebody he absolutely trusts, who he's worked with for years, and who's sent out to give him that advice, and he says no. Why? Because he thinks about 1898, he thinks about World War I, he thinks about the 20s and the 30s and all those Marines I was just talking about, right? And pulling them out of these places, doing imperialist projects. Let's not make that mistake again. At the same time, he thinks about, or just after the war, 1948, Marshall Plan. He lines up what the US could have done to help reconstruct Europe after World War I, what the US didn't do in the Philippines that it didn't fully accomplish, and thinks to himself, okay, we need to advocate for something bigger. Famous Harvard commencement speech, right? Marshall Plan. So positive and negative lessons of thinking in time streams. This is what they argue that policymakers should be doing more of at the National Security Council and all this kind of stuff. And then from my perspective, I said this from the start, and I'll also conclude with this. One of the things that they say, they proceed with 3 assumptions about how policymakers can and should use history, use evidence, and I think this was useful for us in our thinking. Particulars matter, right? So small examples, small particulars matter. And so seize on those, even if you're turning them to different uses, like in a conversation, for instance, or in decision-making is how they would think about it for government. Marginal improvements in performance are worth seeking. So they're saying, look, you're not going to overturn, or I was saying, like, move the needle just a little. Just a marginal improvement is something. So in some ways that's sharing, right? If you're thinking about just experience of war. But more than that, maybe it's interrogating your own assumptions. Maybe it's thinking through in a time stream, what's the next thing that you could do to deal with that? And sort of culminating all that, a little thought can help, right? So they're calling for people to be more thoughtful. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing here. So it's a no-brainer for us. But that, it strikes me that as a whole, then you get, they're proposing a series of questions, and I said this before in a different way. Enlightening questions are the point of every method they proposed, questions that shed light almost regardless of answers. So when you go to ask those questions, know what you want to hear, but don't prejudge what comes out, right? You have a sense of the answers you'd like to hear, but let them all come out and flourish. And so then my last little thing is I can't help but think about difficult history and difficult wars without William Appleman Williams. And this is really just for Ray in some ways. The transcendence of tragedy. So this is the epigraph of his famous book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. And the reason I wanted to note this is we're talking about trauma, and we're talking about the experience of war and how terrible it can be, and thinking about the ways in which you can turn tragedy towards success or towards transcendence. So this comes from Carl Jaspers, a psychiatrist turned philosopher. And for Williams, the great, arguably the most important diplomatic historian, started his own school of thought. Tragedy is a crucial way to move through understanding the U.S.'s role in the world and get to potentially something better. that it takes tragedy. So this is this long quote. Oh, I'm sorry. I can see it over here. Oh, can you see that up there? Yeah, you can see that up there. Sorry. This long quote, we find genuine tragedy only in that destruction which does not prematurely cut short development and success, but which instead grows out of success itself. Breakdown and failure reveal the true nature of things. In failure, life's reality is not lost. On the contrary, here it makes itself wholly and decisively felt. There's no tragedy without transcendence. And so what I would take from that, what I ground the end of this conversation is by confronting those difficult histories of war and experience of war, you can move beyond the tragedies because war is essentially and always tragic. And hopefully move to something more positive in the sense I was saying with policymakers, right, or George Marshall. How do you rebuild? How do you do something better or bigger? How do you fulfill ideals, right? The same thing with those techniques. We're thinking about keywords and key concepts. How do you actually make the U.S., help make the U.S. a guarantor of democracy at home first, perhaps, where it's very much threatened, and abroad where it's also threatened, where nationalism and autarky and totalitarianism are on the march. Anyway, so this arch thinker in U.S. foreign policy thought that there is something possible to get through tragedy, through the experience of war, but you have to really confront that difficult history for what it is and try to cast off your blinders, right? That in fact, sometimes if we can see through it, see past it, really accept it, then there won't be failure. So I'm trying to end with something positive there before we get into the Spanish-American War. So how's that, Jason?
Thank you.
Good? All right, thanks.